Chapter 14. Darwin and the Philosophy of Materialism. Stephen Jay Gould once pointed out that Darwin had worked out his theory of evolution by 1837, but didn't go public with it until 1858. What caused the delay? It wasn't that he was incapacitated. During that time, he wrote a 4-volume treatise on barnacles. In his autobiography, he doubted whether barnacles had been worth the time he spent on them. Gould argued that 2 of Darwin's notebooks, written in 1838 and 1839, contain the answer. Evolution itself wasn't the problem. Earlier in the 19th century, it was a very common heresy, widely and openly discussed. Darwin's own grandfather had broached the subject. The problem was that Darwin's theory was distinguished from all the others by its unremitting materialism, then considered to be a greater heresy than evolution itself. Previous essays on evolution were softened by a reliance on vital forces, organic striving, teleology, and the like. In contrast, Darwin's theory conformed to full-blown materialism, encompassing what he termed the citadel itself. That was the human mind. He argued that the mind was nothing but a special configuration of matter. Gould defined materialism as the claim that matter is the stuff of all existence and the claim that all mental and spiritual phenomena are its byproducts. No notion could be more upsetting to the deepest traditions of Western thought than the statement that mind, however complex and powerful, is simply a product of brain. To be acceptable to his contemporaries, then, Darwin's theory needed a climate of opinion more favorable to materialism. That did not quite exist in the 1830s, but by 1860 the required liberalization had occurred. Earlier in the 19th century, materialism had been actively repressed. Lectures were proscribed, publication hampered, professorships denied, and according to the editor of the early Darwin notebooks, fierce invective and ridicule of materialism appeared in the press. Scholars and scientists learned the lesson and responded to the pressures on them. Sometimes they recanted, and sometimes they published anonymously or delayed publication for many years. In one of those notebooks, Darwin reminded himself to avoid stating how far I believe in materialism, and to say only that emotions, instincts, and so on are so because brain of child resembles parent stock. In another notebook, Darwin mocked himself. Love of the deity effect of organization, oh you materialist. Stephen C. Dilley, a philosopher at St. Edward's University in Texas and a student of Darwin's writings, showed that Darwin did not deploy materialism, sometimes called naturalism, consistently in The Origin. Instead, he strategically and progressively invoked it in the 6 editions of The Origin in order to enhance the persuasiveness of his theory and to marginalize special creation from the scientific discussion. Alex Rosenberg, head of the philosophy department at Duke University and a committed naturalist, described his position this way: what is the world really like? It's fermions and bosons, atomic particles, and everything that can be made up of them, and nothing that can't be made up of them. All the facts about fermions and bosons determine or fix all the other facts about reality and what exists in this universe or any other if, as physics may end up showing, there are other ones. Kai Nielsen, a professor emeritus of philosophy at the University of Calgary, reinforced Rosenberg. Naturalism denies that there are any spiritual or supernatural realities. But the UC Berkeley philosopher John Searle viewed the subject more critically. There is a sense in which materialism is the religion of our time, at least among most of the professional experts in the fields of philosophy, psychology, cognitive science, and other disciplines that study the mind. Like more traditional religions, it is accepted without question, and it provides the framework within which other questions can be posed, addressed, and answered. Notice that if full-blown materialism is true, then Darwin's theory of common descent must also be true. Complex organisms do exist, after all, so atoms and molecules in motion must have somehow whirled themselves into the far more complex structures that we see around us, whether bacterial or human. That also necessitates a finely graded series of structures that gradually and progressively evolve themselves from bits and pieces of molecules into life, bacteria, and so on. We don't need to bring natural selection into the discussion. Armed with his creed, the true believing materialist no longer needs to study evolution in any detail. Phylogeny, fossils, cell structure, who needs them? The materialist can simply retort, we have the starting point, molecules in motion. We have the end point, us. And given that only physical matter exists, how else could such a progression have happened except by a protracted series of parent-offspring stages? At that point, Darwinism becomes little more than a deduction from a philosophy. The science is redundant. There is no need to bother with information theory, enumerate mutations, whether favorable or unfavorable, or fuss about fossils. Darwin's theory is embedded in its underlying materialism. Natural selection, meanwhile, resembles gears disconnected from the engine. It operates as a convenient cover story, seeming to dissolve all the intervening improbabilities. As we already saw in Chapter 5, the best statement of the commitment to materialism was made by Harvard's Richard Lewontin in the New York Review of Books, 1997. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Philip E. Johnson, the founder of the intelligent design movement, commented, Lewontin is telling us that scientific materialists like himself, we, don't believe in materialism because they are convinced by the broad claims of evolution. Rather, it is the other way around. They believe that the entire history of life can be explained by materialistic processes, evolution, because of their prior commitment to materialism. Most academics today share that commitment. A leading example is Tufts University's Daniel Dennett. In Consciousness Explained, 1991, he wrote, "The prevailing wisdom, variously expressed and argued for, is materialism. There is only one sort of stuff, namely matter, the physical stuff of physics, chemistry, and physiology, and the mind is somehow nothing but a physical phenomenon." In Darwin's Dangerous Idea, 1995, he derided any alternative to this philosophy as relying on skyhooks, or a source of design that does not build on lower, simpler layers. Darwinism, on the other hand, relies on cranes, said Dennett, and cranes build from the bottom up. Avowed materialists such as Dennett embrace an ideology. They are the atheistic counterparts to Christians who openly say, I believe in the Bible and therefore I don't believe in Darwinism. Creationists are easy for materialists to rebut because they can reply, that is just your belief. We don't accept that because we don't believe in the Bible. In the same way, skeptics can say to the materialists, that is just your belief. We don't have to accept your philosophy. Furthermore, it is the real basis of your faith in Darwinism. The difference is the premise of what can be accepted as knowledge. Someone who accepts only what can be called scientific evidence must a priori reject everything else. The National Committee of Science Education identified non-natural explanations with miracles and said, whether or not miracles occur, they cannot be part of a scientific explanation. They were right, but failed to demonstrate that miracles cannot occur, and so begged the question. Denial of free will. If mind is just a special configuration of brain cells, then mind is nothing but matter. How can neurons decide to do one thing rather than another? They can't. With the mind reduced to matter, we can't decide to do something different. Nerve cells can't make decisions. Therefore, materialism repudiates the freedom of the will. The consistent materialist sees this, denies free will, and dismisses consciousness as a delusion. The best-known Darwinians follow that path and should be commended for their consistency. Our sense of self is a neuronal illusion, said Jerry Coyne, a fully paid-up materialist and the author of Why Evolution is True. The molecular biologist Francis Crick said the same thing. Your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are, in fact, no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. You are nothing but a pack of neurons. Michael Egnor, a neurosurgeon and professor in the Department of Pediatrics at Stony Brook University, replied that certain aspects of the mind, intelligence, and will are inherently immaterial. Therefore, they cannot be yoked to matter deterministically. Thereupon, a defender of the Jerry Coyne position said that such an argument implies that computers can't even work. For example, wrote the Coyne defender, how does a computer know that a particular binary string is an ASCII character versus a binary number? For anybody who knows how computers do work, the answer lies in the design of the computer chips, base instruction sets, and how more complex concepts are built from simpler ones. To which Egnor responded, your computer doesn't know a binary string from a ham sandwich. Your math book doesn't know algebra. Your Rolodex doesn't know your cousin's address. Your watch doesn't know what time it is. Your car doesn't know where you're driving. Your television doesn't know who won the football game last night. Your cell phone doesn't know what you said to your girlfriend this morning. People know things. Devices like computers and books and Rolodexes and watches and cars and televisions and cell phones don't know anything. They don't have minds. They are artifacts, paper and plastic and silicon things designed and manufactured by people, and they provide people with the means to leverage their human knowledge. The materialist philosophy puts its advocates at odds with the great majority of mankind, alerting the rest of us to the implausibility of what we are expected to believe. Being told that evolution is a fact can be intimidating because many laymen won't know how to respond. But to be told your will is not free even though you think it is, or you are an automaton and you don't even know it, is likely to get people's backs up. Richard Dawkins has aroused people in this way, and Phil Johnson respects him and Daniel Dennett for doing so. The same applies to the late Cornell biologist William B. Provine, 1943 to 2015. He and Johnson would debate these issues on nationwide tours. Johnson disagreed with Provine intellectually, but respected his consistency and enjoyed his company. Provine outdid everyone in his bluntness. Here is one of his better-known sallies. Let me summarize my views on what modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear. There are no gods, no purposes, no goal-directed forces of any kind. There is no life after death. When I die, I am absolutely certain that I am going to be dead. That's the end for me. There is no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning to life, and no free will for humans either. Richard Dawkins made the same claim. Religion teaches the dangerous nonsense that death is not the end. It's interesting to reflect that Dawkins, Provine, and some others may in the end cause more trouble for evolutionism than the theistic evolutionists whose goal in life is to have it both ways. The best-known group of theistic evolutionists is Biologos, founded by Francis Collins, now the director of the National Institutes of Health. He and others, notably Brown University's Kenneth Miller, embrace both Christianity and Darwinism and see no incompatibility between them. Methodological naturalism. We come now to a distinction, contrasting methodological naturalism, MN, with philosophical naturalism, PN. The term methodological naturalism was invented by the Christian philosopher Paul de Vries in the mid-1980s when he was teaching at a Christian institution, Wheaton College. Methodological naturalists argue that Christians don't need to accept full-blown materialism, or PN. The methodological naturalist proceeds as if naturalism is true when doing natural science, without actually believing that naturalism is true. Here is the reasoning. Scientists work only with nature, not with God, souls, etc., and therefore in their work, for all practical purposes, nature can be treated as if it is all that exists. But religious life, ethics, etc., do not have to assume that nature is all that exists. So if the MN/PN distinction is valid, a Christian scientist can be a methodological naturalist all week long in the laboratory, while remaining philosophically non-naturalist outside of the laboratory, at church on Sunday, etc. Thus, theistic evolutionists can be as naturalistic as Darwinians when doing science, while being anti-Darwinian in religion and ethics due to their non-naturalistic beliefs about God, immortality, etc. Methodological naturalism is supported by the National Center for Science Education, the AAAS, the National Academy of Sciences, and by other groups populated mainly by materialists. They don't want to be seen as strident atheists or as bullying their theistic fellow citizens, says Discovery Institute's Paul Nelson. Full-blown materialism invites confrontation and arguments over evidence, arguments which they might lose. Nelson is critical of the MN/PN distinction. He says that methodological naturalism is the polite, apparently inoffensive, seemingly religiously neutral version of materialism. It looks modest, merely promoting observation and testability. It seems to claim we're all good empiricists here, ruling out spooks or occult causes, and that makes it easy to sell to theists who are eager to be seen as reasonable and on board with the science of Darwinism. But its practical consequences, Nelson added, are identical to those of full-blown naturalism. In his book, Darwin's Doubt, Stephen Meyer argues that inferences to intelligent causation, while fully warranted by the evidence of the Cambrian explosion, run afoul of methodological naturalism. Its working assumption, Meyer said, is that all features of the natural world can be explained by material causes without recourse to purposive intelligence, mind, or conscious agency. But its fatal defect is easily seen. If researchers refuse as a matter of principle, namely MN, to consider the design hypothesis, they will obviously miss any evidence that happens to support it. One cannot evaluate the evidence for or against any hypothesis that has been ruled out a priori. For this and other reasons, intelligent design theorists regard MN as an obstacle to knowledge and a rule that should be dispensed with. On the other side, Robert Bishop of BioLogos thinks that MN requires phenomena to be explained solely by material or physical causes. Agency should be restricted to human activities only. An intelligent agent is a presupposition external to cellular and evolutionary biology, and so is brought in from the outside. Intelligent design, which does indeed countenance non-material causation, therefore violates the well-defined boundaries of natural science. At that point, biologists rightly object, Bishop said. But mind itself imports causation from the outside, because it cannot be reduced to matter. This is the argument that Thomas Nagel has eloquently made. Why materialism is almost certainly false. The most prominent recent criticism of materialism has come from Thomas Nagel, a philosopher at New York University. His essay, "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" received a lot of attention and was later reprinted in his Mortal Questions, 1979. His more recent book, Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False, 2012, may turn out to be a game changer. Nagel also expressed support for various scholars associated with the intelligent design movement, including Steve Mayer, Michael Behe, and David Berlinski. It is difficult for die-hard materialists to call him a creationist because he is an atheist. Nagel received a lot of support, a turn of events suggesting that we may be moving back to the pre-materialist intellectual climate of the 1830s. Inadvertently, the philosopher Michael Ruse aided that idea. Initially a Baptist, Ruse spent half his life writing books defending Darwinism and along the way became an atheist. He once told Daniel Dennett that he, Dennett, could be more effective with his materialism if only he were more tactful. Then he compared Thomas Nagel to Sam Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford who debated T.H. Huxley in 1860. Huxley, incidentally, was not a materialist, believing materialism to involve grave philosophical error. In a review of Nagel's book in 2013, the evolutionary geneticist H. Alan Orr wrote, "Consciousness is the most conspicuous obstacle to a comprehensive naturalism that relies only on the resources of physical science. The existence of consciousness seems to imply that the physical description of the universe, in spite of its richness and explanatory power, is only part of the truth, and that the natural order is far less austere than it would be if physics and chemistry accounted for everything." Nagel made the following objection to materialism, or naturalism. Evolutionary naturalism provides an account of our capacities that undermines their reliability, and in doing so undermines itself. Put another way, if our minds are simply the accidental products of a blind process, what reason do we have for accepting materialistic claims as true? Years ago, C.S. Lewis made the same case in his book Miracles. A strict materialism refutes itself for the reason long ago given by Professor Haldane, Lewis said, continuing as follows. "If my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true, and hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms." Lewis added, "A theory which explained everything else in the whole universe, but which made it impossible to believe that our thinking was valid, would be utterly out of court, for that theory would itself have been reached by thinking. And if thinking is not valid, that theory would, of course, be demolished. It would have destroyed its own credentials. It would be an argument which proved that no argument was sound, a proof that there are no such things as proofs." Nagel also said that minds convey subjective experiences that are outside the objective world of space and time. So the physical sciences cannot describe such experiences or tell us how the world appears to individuals. Does my red look like your red? How can we know? Nagel: there can be a purely physical description of the neurophysiological processes that give rise to an experience, and also of the physical behavior that is typically associated with it. But such a description, however complete, will leave out the subjective essence of the experience, how it is from the point of view of its subject, without which it would not be a conscious experience at all. In short, the physical sciences necessarily leave an important aspect of nature unexplained. That it was even necessary for an eminent philosopher to make such common-sense claims shows how deeply embedded materialism has become in our time. Nagel went on to offer criticism of evolutionism, while at the same time distancing himself from creationism. Since the long process of biological evolution is responsible for the existence of conscious organisms, and since a purely physical process cannot explain their existence, it follows that biological evolution must be more than just a physical process, and the theory of evolution, if it is to explain the existence of conscious life, must become more than just a physical theory. In the end, the most sensible position may be to substitute the dualism of René Descartes for the materialism of Darwinism and his followers. Dualism holds that the mind is a non-physical substance, evident to all of us in our conscious experience. Materialism is surely false, to amend Nagel only slightly, but it's a false philosophy with side benefits. It serves to remind us that Darwinism itself is mostly a philosophy dressed up as science. And once the philosophy of materialism is rejected, can Darwinism itself be far behind? Dislodged from its bed of materialism, what is left? Darwin's atheism. Darwin himself was antagonistic to religion, and became ever more so as he aged. In his autobiography, he wrote, "Thus disbelief crept over me at a very slow rate, but was at last complete. The rate was so slow that I felt no distress, and have never since doubted even for a single second that my conclusion was correct. I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true, for if so, the plain language of the text seems to show that the men who do not believe, and this would include my father, brother, and almost all my best friends, will be everlastingly punished, and this is a damnable doctrine." I shall look more closely at his religious views in Chapter 20.